Okay, so good morning, everyone. This is going to be a short lecture today. Alfredo is going to take over for the second half. So I'm going to be talking about the practice of convolutional nets, how they're used in various ways. And the first thing I should say is that they're used a lot, and they're used almost everywhere where there is image recognition to be done, but also in a lot of other applications. And we'll go through some of them, not entirely today, but perhaps in subsequent lecture. Today, I'm going to be speaking mostly about computer vision. I'm going to be illustrating some of those use with sort of a little bit of sort of historical ways that those things have been kind of proposed, going back to the early 1990s. There are tens of thousands of papers published every year on using convolutional nets for various things. And so I cannot possibly do an exhaustive overview of everything. Just looking at the CVPR conference, which is sort of the main computer vision conference, there are thousands of papers literally every year just on this topic, right? So so much that, nobody can really keep track of it, and certainly not me. Okay, so we talked about the basic modules that form a convolutional net last week, and sort of the very basic architecture of convolutional net, where you stack convolution operations or multiple convolution operations interspersed with nonlinearities and pooling operations, where the spatial or temporal dimension is reduced. And we can ask ourselves, what are convolutional nets good for? And so the design of it is comes from the idea that the idea of convolution comes from the fact that you can have features that can appear anywhere on the image, and so if you want a feature detector at one location, it's a good idea to have the same feature detector at another location. So there comes the idea of local feature detectors and then replicating them over the field of view, essentially, right? Which is the idea of correlation. Now, this is due to properties of signals that, natural signals in particular, things that come to you in the form of an array, a multidimensional array or a single-dimensional array, right? So it can be a time series. It could be multiple time series. So it'd be a multi-channel, one-dimensional array, if you want. So in effect, a two-dimensional array. It could be an image, which is a two-dimensional array. Be a color image or a multispectral image, so an image that has more than 3 colors, right? These sensors, they can do this. For example, with bands in infrared and ultraviolet, there's a lot of satellite imaging, for example, that have hundreds of bands. So that would be a 3-dimensional array, where 2 of the dimensions are actually organized, but the third dimension, not necessarily, right? They could be just channels that don't have any structure to them, any order, if you want. And then you can have 4-dimensional arrays. So 4-dimensional arrays would be, another example of 3-dimensional array would be volumetric images. So the kind of image you get out of an MRI machine, for example, or in some cases, some sensors like LiDAR, which basically gives you an XYZ location for every point it looks at. So it gives you not just an image with grayscale. You could think of the grayscale being replaced by a depth, right? And you could interpret this either as a 2D image with different values, or as a 3D image where each voxel indicates the presence or absence of an object in it. There are actually libraries to deal with this. There's something called PyTorch 3D, which does a bit of that. Then other 3D data includes video. Or 4D data would be color video, right? And you can imagine, all kinds of signals that have, more dimensions, right? If you have like a video or volumetric image, like what you get from a ultrasound, for example, or short-term MRI, functional MRI images for the brain, things like that. Okay. So that's the first property. The data comes to you in the form of an array. The second property is that the signals have strong local correlations, which means that neighboring values, pixels, voxels, whatever, are likely to take similar values. Okay, so this is the case for an image. if you take neighboring pixels in an image and you compute the statistics of how different are two neighboring pixels in an image, they're generally not very different unless you have an edge in this image, but edges are rare, actually, okay? But as the distance between the two pixels you're measuring grows, the likelihood that those two pixels have similar color decreases. Okay, so what that suggests is that you have strong local correlations. And what that suggests is that there are patterns when you take a block of 5 pixels, 5 by 5 pixels, for example, or maybe more, the type of patterns you observe does not cover the set of all possible combinations of pixels because of those correlations, okay? So what that suggests is that it's interesting to detect particular combinations of those pixels, flat uniform areas, soft gradients, edges, maybe gratings, things like that, right? So what that means is that you can sort of abstract the content of such a patch in an image by a list of presence or absence of particular features, right? So that's kind of the idea. But that's due to the fact that you have strong local correlations, right? So if you were to take an image and randomly permute the pixels so that you break the local correlations and you plug a convolutional net to it, the convolutional net wouldn't do very well. A fully connected network will work exactly the same, right? Fully connected network doesn't care about the topology of the input. It comes at a price because you have to connect everything to everything. So it's not always a good idea to use that. So convolutional nets exploit this local correlation, and the weight sharing, exploit the fact that features basically can appear anywhere because you can move your eyes or your camera, and you never know where a particular object will appear or a particular feature. And that's basically the fourth property: signals in which objects are subject to translations, distortions, etc. And you want the system to be able to recognize those objects or classify them independently of those distortions, right? And that's basically provided, kind of hardwired a little bit by the pooling operation. Okay, so when the signals include text, music, audio, speech, time series, and things of that type. 2D ConvNets, as I said, images, but also time frequency representations of a speech and audio. So this is basically a way of turning audio signal or speech signal into basically an image where one dimension is time and the other dimension is frequency, and every value indicates the energy of the signal in that particular frequency band at that particular time. Okay, the spectrogram is an example of this, and so this this kind of representation is used for recognition, localization, detection, things like that. And then 3D ConvNet for video, biomedical images, hyperspectral images. So this is the example I was citing of satellite images where you don't have just 3 colors. You might have like 100 different channels of different frequency bands. That's used for astronomy as well, spectroscopy, basically. So they are the color, if you want, is a third dimension, right? So there's a lot of information in every pixel, and that changes the thing. So, why do we need to stack layers in ConvNets? Why is it interesting to stack layers? For the same reason that deep learning is a good idea. We need to stack layers, but it's due to the fact that the world is compositional in a way, and I alluded to this a little last time. So in a convolutional net, when you train a convolutional net to do image recognition, to classify objects, for example, what you see, and this is a visualization by Rob Fergus and his former student Matt Ziller. What you see is feature detectors at a low level that detect those simple motifs, oriented edges, and color gradients and things like this. So essentially, what I was just saying, motifs that appear surprisingly often in images and are informative for whatever task. And it doesn't matter what task you train this ConvNet to do, it will almost always come up with things like this, okay? It will always be slightly different, but things like this, essentially. Now, what you can try to do is try to figure out what is the input pattern that will maximally activate a particular unit at a particular layer, okay? The network that has been tested here is something that has something like 20 layers. And so so I'm only representing 3 of them, but at some level, somewhere, there are feature detectors here that detect things like circles and gratings and corners and simple kind of local shapes and motifs, which then in subsequent layers are assembled to basically form parts of objects. So it's sort of a weird visualization here, but that's essentially kind of patterns that will maximally activate a particular detector in a particular layer in a convolutional net. And this, is appropriate for natural data because the world is compositional in the sense that, in physics is clearly the case. We have elementary particles at the low level, or string even at the lower level, although that's not verified. But let's say elementary particles like quarks and things like that, and bosons and whatever, and those assemble to form other particles like neutrons and protons, and then those assemble to form atoms, and then those assemble to form molecules, and then materials, and then parts of objects, collection of objects and planets and scenes and things like that, right? So there is this sort of hierarchy in physics or in natural science, and every level has a different name, right? So there's high energy physics at the bottom, and then there is solid state physics or condensed matter physics, and then there is chemistry or physical chemistry. Then there is organic chemistry, where you have big molecules, and then biology or biochemistry, and then biology, and then you need multiple levels of description, and then when we talk about like human society, there is economics and sociology and stuff like that, right? Psychology. So at every level, we have a different level of description of reality that uses different concepts. And it's this idea of hierarchy, right? So that's one reason why perhaps this idea of hierarchy is a good idea. And one of the big mysteries of the universe is, why is it that the world is so organized that in such a way that we can actually understand it? Because it could be a complete mess that we cannot possibly understand. There's a famous quote by Albert Einstein, which I don't remember if I told you already. Maybe Alfredo does. He said, the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that the world is comprehensible or understandable. And this is the reason is because it's compositional. So we have levels of description that kind of describe in some abstract level what happens at the lower level, ignoring the details. In fact, there are explicit models of physics that things like something called tensor networks, and they have architectures to basically represent the interaction between sort of different quantities that look very much like convolutional nets. Is one called so the two techniques, one called renormalization group theory, which kind of describes a complex system by abstracting the local details, if you want. So this is used in condensed matter physics, and then things like this multiscale entanglement renormalization, and that's also called MERA. It looks very much like a convolutional net, and it's kind of designed to represent the complex interaction that occur between sort of different quantities. So there's probably some sort of deep cosmic reason for multilayer systems, to be useful, and probably why we have them in our brain. Okay, let's come back to Earth a little bit and talk about the practicality of convolutional nets. And so we talked about convolutional nets for single objects, but it turns out you can use convolutional nets as a detector or as a way of recognizing multiple objects. We'll talk about the more kind of complex way of doing this in a subsequent lecture on structure prediction, but I'm going to tell you kind of the basic idea here. So pretty early on in the early 90s, we realized that we could apply convolutional nets not just to recognize a single object, but multiple objects, right? So what you see here is a convolutional net that has been trained to recognize a 32 by 32 image. So every output, if you want, is influenced by a 32 by 32 input. But in fact, the convolutional net has, after training, has been made bigger. So the input was extended to 64 by 32, right? So or 32 vertically by 64 horizontally. And what happened to the convolutional net is that we kind of replicated it over multiple windows of 32 pixels. And so, and I'll tell you in a minute how that's done. Okay. So imagine that you take a 32 by 32 window, run your favorite convolutional net for character recognition. It gives you a score for each category, right? Then you shift this by a few pixels, let's say 4 pixels, and it gives you another answer. And then you shift it by another 4 pixels. So whenever a character is more or less centered in that window, this particular ConvNet will actually produce a reliable answer as to what it's seeing within this window. You can train the system. When you train it, you show it characters that are centered and tell it, you show it a 5 and you say that's a 5. And then you show a 5 that's slightly off-centered and you tell it, don't answer anything because it's not centered. You can't tell what it is. So you train it to explicitly not produce anything, right? So there's no softmax on the output, basically. You just turn off all the outputs. And what you can also do is show a character in the center during training, and then show other characters on the side that you can bring, more or less close to the character in the center, but train the system to only recognize the one in the center, basically to ignore the ones on the side. And then you can also show kind of images where you have 2 characters on the side and nothing in the center, and you again train it to produce none of the above. Okay. So when you take this neural net and you shift it over the input, it's going to turn on and detect a character whenever there is one that's more or less centered in it. And then it will probably say none of the above whenever there is no decent character that's is being centered. So this is an example of this where this ConvNet has been kind of shifted every 4 pixels, right? The input window is 32 pixels. And what you see here is the winning category with where the intensity of the grayscale indicates the score, if you want, of the winning category. So this system kind of detects, the 5 in multiple places whenever it looks like a 5. The 1 is basically only one location. And what you see is that the system doesn't quite care, where the characters end and begin. It basically figures out which parts of the image kind of fit with each other to produce a score. As I said, this is an old idea that was developed in the lab that I was working in at Bell Labs at AT&T, and here is how you do it in practice. So that turns out to be extremely cheap to do. This idea of kind of replicating a convolutional net over an input, over a larger input, and handling variable size inputs. We used to call this SDNN, which stands for Space Displacement Neural Net, but it's really just a convolutional net. Okay, and so imagine that you've trained a single character recognizer whose input window is 32 by 32, or in this case, maybe a little more, okay? And you want to apply it with a sliding window over the entire, over a bigger input representing a word, for example, a handwritten word. The way you do this is you don't recompute the convolutional net at every location. You don't need to do this because when you shift the convolutional net on the left by a few pixels, there's a whole bunch of layers, activations you already computed, right? Because you're using the same weights all over. So the basic idea here is that you extend the size of the convolutions, which you can do without retraining anything, okay? You use the same weights that you had for this network, you just make the input bigger and you apply the convolution, and so the output gets bigger automatically, okay? And every layer gets bigger according to that. And now what you have to think about is that what I told you were fully connected layers last week that we put on top of the convolutional net for the last few layers. I lied to you. They're not actually fully connected layers. They are actually convolutional layers as well, with a convolution kernel of size 1 by 1. Okay, so I need to unpack this a little bit. So I'm first going to show you a sort of explicit example of this little demo I showed you earlier. So this shows when you take a particular output, let's say the red output here, that detects either a 5 or a 6 or a 3. When you back project it on the previous layer, you get a feature vector which is basically a column of this feature vector here, I'm representing only one value here as a little red square. Okay, so it's just a single value, but because it's multiple channels, you have 120 of those, because there's 120 channels. Those are connected to those red squares on the previous layer at every feature map, represented by this. The size of this, I believe, is 5 by 5. And then you go back to the previous layer, which is I don't remember if this is before or after pooling. I think it's after pooling. So the input window you get here is something like 10 by 10, I believe, or something like that. And then there is a pooling, which is 2 by 2, and then convolution. And so you get the 32 by 32 input. So you draw the diagram of this, and those sizes just come out of it. Now, when you make the convolution larger on the input, the next output, because of the various subsampling pooling layers, is going to be shifted by 4 pixels. And I'll make a drawing that explains why this is, okay, in a minute. So each of these guys, the output here, the green output, looks at a window that is shifted by 4 pixels from the previous one. Why 4? It's because there are 2 layers of 2 by 2 subsampling. And so the overall subsampling ratio is 4. And what that means is that when you shift the output by 1, you shift the input by 4. Or when you shift the input by 4, you shift the output by 1, okay? But again, I'll draw this so you get a better idea for that. Okay, so now what we have is basically a collection of answers with various scores. And what we have to do is what's called non-maximum suppression, okay, NMS. This is used universally in computer vision. And what that means is that you see at one point there are 3 detectors, 3 instances of this of the output that detect the number 5. Okay, for one of them, the 5 is kind of centered. For the other ones, it's kind of on the side, but they see it's a 5, so they say it's a 5. Now you have to have some post-processing that says there's only one 5. Okay, and that's called non-maximum suppression. So basically, you take the scores of all the categories within a small window, and you say who is winning. Which category has the highest score within this window? And I'm just going to use this guy as the winner and then suppress the everybody else. So I know there is only one 5, even though there are 3 5 detectors that turn on, because they're all seeing the same 5, really. Okay. Same for the 7 here. It appears twice. Only one of them. So this is basically what happens here between this list of detections here and the final answer, which only contains 2 characters. It's a kind of non-maximum suppression. It's done with what's called a weighted finite state machine, but I'm not going to go into the details of this until we talk about structure prediction. But there are many ways to do non-maximum suppression. And in fact, it's kind of going away a little bit because now people are replacing this handcrafted process by actually a trainable neural net as well. The training non-maximum suppression, if you want. Okay, so let me... so here's another example of an early object detection system with convolutional net, probably the first one actually, from a paper that I co-authored with a few people in 1993, although the work was done in 1991. And this is the same idea. This was for face detection. So the data sets at the time were really small. We had to collect our own. It was only a couple thousand images or something. So the idea there for detection is that you take a collection of images, some of which have faces, some of which have no faces, okay, no face, from whatever, a photo that you took that you're pretty sure has no people in them. And then you train a neural net, which in this case had an input of 20 by 20 pixels. You train it to say, turn on the output whenever there is a face and turn off whenever there is no face. And you do this only for input windows of 20 by 20 pixels. And then what you do to do face detection is that you slide this convolutional net over an image, and whenever there's a face that is roughly 20 by 20 pixels, it's going to turn on. Okay. Now the problem is that faces can appear at different sizes. So what you do now is you take your image, you subsample it by some factor, another scale, and you apply your network again at that new scale, and then do it again for even another scale, right? So eventually, there's going to be one scale where the faces appear to be roughly at the right size, and where your detector is going to turn on. So these are the detection maps here that you see. I think bright means high score for detection, and dark means no detection. Those appear bright, but they're not actually that good of a detection. So you need a kind of a blob of activity for the detection to be high scoring. And you see them here at scale 8, for example, or scale 7, scale 6. You have kind of blobs of high score activities that kind of represent the presence of a phase. So here you do non-maximum suppression again. You say for every location and scale, which is the blob that has the highest overall score, and you decide that's a winning candidate, and you suppress the other ones. And that's the result in the end, what you get here on the right with the 4 winners. So let me tell you a bit about this replication over a field that I was just telling you about. Okay, so let's say you have an input image, and you're going to apply a first convolutional net. I'm going to draw it red. It's a very simple convolutional net. It's got 3 kernel size 3. Okay, then pooling, and then another kernel. Okay, so this is convolution, pooling, convolution. And this is pooling by 2, convolution by 3. Okay, you get an output, right? Now let's imagine you want to apply the same convolutional net shifted by, let's say, 2 pixels, okay? So I'm going to draw that convolutional net again. Okay, this is the very same convolutional net applied to a window shifted by 2 pixels, all right? Now, notice that this part of the network is shared between those two instances of the convolutional net, right? I do not need to recompute those pink units here because I already computed them, okay? So it'd be stupid to recompute the entire network since I already computed part of it, right? And if I kind of keep going there, you can imagine, of course, that if I shift by 2 pixels again, I'm going to get a third network. Sorry, forgot one. Here we go. And again, I don't need to recompute those pink guys. Okay, they are in common. So what do I have to do in the end? What I have to do in the end is basically I just take my entire input. So it turns out to be like super simple. I take my entire input and I just compute a convolution over the entire input. I just apply my convolution, and I get a layer here that is whatever size is appropriate that corresponds to the size of the input when I apply the convolution. Okay, so I don't need to do anything really. I just do that convolution. I get the result I want, and then I apply the next layer, which is a pooling 2 by 2, okay, over the entire input, and then I apply the convolution again. So what used to be, and let's say I have a fully connected layer here. Okay, so I'm going to add a fully connected layer here to my network. Okay, so this is what you would call an F. Okay, the fully connected layer. But in fact, it's not a fully connected layer because to be able to compute this extended convolutional net, what I need to do is use the same weights at every location here for this operation. And what it comes down to is a 1-by-1 convolution, essentially, right? So I still have shared weights, and which is one of the properties of convolution. It's just that now my convolution kernel only looks at one value. So it's as if I had a convolution kernel of size 1-by-1. But of course, you have multiple channels here, multiple channels here, and you have a whole matrix here between. It shows that this matrix is shared across the different locations, right? Okay, now let's take those two guys and see when we back project, what do they look at? So this guy, the red guy here, looks at this input of size 6. And the green guy looks at that input, also size 6. And the orange guy at, I hope I did it right. I think I screwed up. Okay. I think this guy actually is like that. And then this guy is here, and this should be ignored. Okay. Okay, now they're shifted by 2 pixels because of this subsampling, because of this pooling layer that subsamples by a factor of 2. If we didn't have any pooling layer, but we only had convolutions with stride, we would have the same effect. That thing would be shifted by whatever the product of the strides of the operations we're doing at the various layers is. Okay, so if we have a ConvNet with various dense convolutions, and then one layer of pooling subsampling with a subsampling ratio of 2, and then another layer of pooling and subsampling with subsampling ratio of 3, then the overall subsampling ratio is 6, which means every output will see a window that is shifted by 6 pixels compared to the previous one. Okay. Any question at this point?
Yeah, there are plenty of questions here. So for the animation you showed before with the 3 and 1 that were moving, and you had the multiple digits, this one. So we had actually 3 questions, which are basically the same. So how do you deal with multiple characters, right? So someone is asking, do we need knowledge of how many characters are in an image for these methods, or the number of characters are also limited by the system? So there are several kind of questions about, there's some confusion about the multiple characters.
Okay, the short answer is you don't need to know how many characters there are in the first place, but the proper way to do this requires something called structure prediction. And I'm not going to talk about this today. We'll talk about this in a future lecture. There might even be a homework about this. So you'll learn about this, okay? I promise. But the short answer is you don't need to know how many characters there are in advance if you design the system properly or train it properly. So you can apply this to any kind of detection, phase detection, pedestrian detection, whatever detection you want, detection of tumors in medical images, things like this. And the idea goes back, a very long time, as I showed you. You can simultaneously do pose estimation as well. So the example you see at the top left here is some work I did at the NEC Research Institute before I came to NYU in 2003, which was published a couple of years later. And this system does pose estimation. So the output is not just, is there a face or not, but also what is the orientation of the face. And this is some slightly more recent work. So all of those works precede the craze, the new craze of around deep learning of the last 8 years or so. This is work from 2010, 2012 or so. Another example of this pose estimation phase detection system. This is my grandparents' wedding, actually. Those are my grandparents. Okay, so if you can detect objects, you can also segment images. So what does that mean to segment an image? It means basically identifying every pixel in an image as to whether it belongs to an object or not. You don't care what the object is, maybe, but you care about kind of separating an object from its background or classifying each region in a different way. So this is, again, some relatively old work where we train a convolutional net basically to indicate on those microscopic images whether a particular region or a particular pixel belongs to a cell. This is an embryo of little worm, C. elegans, and you can see the nucleus of the cell and the cytoplasm, and then the outside. And we trained this ConvNet to classify, to basically take a little region, very small, a few pixels by a few pixels, and then classify the central pixel of that window as to whether it's cytoplasm, outside cell membrane, or the nucleus, or the wall of the nucleus, if you want. The idea there was so you could count like how many cells. These are videos actually, and you could count like if you can see automatically more or less if the embryo is developing normally. This is for geneticists of development, and those are some of the kind of raw results of each color indicates a category. Those are very noisy images, so you don't get perfect result. But then you can clean them up with something a little bit like non-maximum suppression with a little bit of post-processing, and so you get sort of fairly reliable idea of how many cells is in this image, and if the nuclei have the right shape and things like that. Here's another example which is more impressive. This is also relatively old work, which I was not involved in, by Sebastian Song, who at the time was at MIT, is at Princeton now. And he's been interested for the last 15 years in what's called connectomics. So this is basically taking a piece of brain tissue, and then slicing it into very, very thin slices, and then analyzing the images so that you can reconstruct the graph of connections of the neurons between them. So this is an old video from the late 2000s. It's probably about 13 years old or so. That represent only a small proportion, a small percentage of all the neurons that have been identified. Each neuron has a different color, so they run a segmentation algorithm that tries to figure out, after running the convolutional net, to identify the boundaries between neurons and other neurons, or between neurons and whatever is in between. They can reconstruct the 3D volume of all the neurons and the dendrites and the axons and whatever. And if they can identify the contacts between neurons, they can also basically reconstruct the wiring diagram, if you want, of a piece of brain. There is the data actually was collected using crowdsourcing at this website here, iwire.org. You can play with that if you want. And there's a recent review paper that I'm a co-author on called The Mind of a Mouse, and it basically advocates for the fact that we should do this for the entire brain of a mouse. It's been done for the entire brain of the fruit fly, which is very small. But right now, we just don't have the technology to do it for a brain that's larger than that. And so this is basically a call for a kind of project, worldwide or national, to essentially figure out the entire wiring diagram of the brain of a given mouse. The amount of data that would be required for this is absolutely staggering. A mouse has maybe 50 million neurons. So it's actually smaller than some of the neural nets that are being used in practice today, but it's absolutely gigantic in terms of connections and the complexity of it. So that's a really interesting application of convolutional net to science, and to neuroscience in particular. And it goes back, 15 years or so. This is an old video. There's more recent ones that you can get by looking for Sebastian Song lab at Princeton. Here's another application of image segmentation. So this is the same idea, where you also take a window over an image. So here, this was a three-dimensional window, okay, in this example that's taken. And then you train a convolutional net looking at this little window. You train the convolutional net to tell you whether the voxel you're looking at is, the inside of a neuron, the outside of a neuron, or the membrane, if you want. Okay, so that afterwards you can post-process and kind of do the segmentation. This is the same idea here, but it's two-dimensional. This was done about the same time, actually, maybe a couple of years out, roughly about the same time. And this is the idea of what in computer vision is called semantic segmentation. So here you run a convolutional net with a sliding window over an entire image. You take a window, so the input window that corresponds to a particular output in this convolutional net, in this case, is something like 40 pixels by 40 pixels or something like that. And you train the system to label the central pixel as to whether, in this case, whether it's something the robot can drive over, or whether it's an obstacle that the robot would bump into and cannot traverse, like tall grass and things like that, and brushes. So this was a project that was done in my lab at NYU between 2005 and 2008, and directed by, well, it involved Raya Hetzel and Pierre Samanet, who were the two main contributors to that project in my lab, but there were a large cast of characters. That was in collaboration with a startup company in New Jersey called NetScale Technology, which now actually belongs to NVIDIA. So they actually work on autonomous driving at NVIDIA. Raya Hetzel is head of robotics research at DeepMind. Pierre Samanet is also working in robotics, but at Google Brain. So anyway, so here the data was actually collected semi-automatically. So we just ran the robot in nature, and we used a stereo vision system to figure out if a particular pixel is on the ground or above the ground. And from that, we can derive a label, okay? And this is the kind of labeling here at the bottom in the center that you would get from this stereo vision system. And the problem with stereo vision is that it only works at a limited range. So it works up to about 10 meters, and then beyond 10 meters, you can't tell really from triangulation with two cameras. You can't tell if a particular pixel you're looking at is on the ground or above the ground. So that has kind of limited range. You can't really drive a robot in nature if your vision stops at 10 meters. You can avoid obstacles, but you can't plan a long-range path. So what we do is we use those labels to train a convolutional net to label the pixel, but the convolutional net only needs a single camera image, so it doesn't rely on stereo. And so it's not limited in range. And when we apply the convolutional net to the entire image, it tells us, well, the path continues. In fact, this convolutional net is trained in the lab on collected data, but it also kind of trained itself on the fly as it drives. So the last layer is actually trained online. And I'm going to spare you the details. This is the architecture of the convolutional net. It actually looks at images that are kind of bands, if you want, more or less centered on the horizon, because it doesn't need to to look at the sky and and anything else at multiple scales. So it uses this multi-scale idea that I told you about earlier. And this is sort of a video that shows how the system works, more or less. Okay, so you get labels from stereo vision. You also get labels from the neural net, and you can reconstruct where every pixel is in the world because you know roughly what the distance, and so you can put this in a map. This map is represented here at the top, and the map, the content on the map, if it's green, indicates that the robot probably can drive there, and if it's purple, it's probably an obstacle. If it's red, it's also an obstacle. If it's blue, it just means like I haven't seen this. It's obstructed. The view is obstructed by an obstacle, so I can't tell. So I'm going to avoid going there. And then you can run a shortest path planning algorithm to kind of get the robot to go somewhere. So this is the robot being annoyed by graduate students. This is Raya Hetzel on the right and Pierre Samanet on the left. And they are making the life of this robot pretty impossible. But they're entitled to do this because they actually built the code for it. They didn't build a robot that was given to us by DARPA. And they were pretty confident the system was working well because if the robot didn't stop before their legs, they could break their legs. Okay, so a couple of years later, a few data sets appeared that had a small number of images, something like 2,000 images or so, where people had labeled every pixel in images with a category. So not just, is it traversable or not, but is it a window, is it a door, is it a sidewalk, is it a road, is it a car, is it a person, etc., or is it a tree? So that's the problem of what's called category level semantic segmentation. And we built one of the first, the first system using convolutional nets for this, around 2011, 2010 or so, and published it in 2012. The computer vision community at the time was extremely skeptical in 2011 of convolutional nets. And even though this paper kind of beat the record on the data set, it was actually rejected from CVPR. We published it in a machine learning conference in ICML 6 months later. So there was a lot of skepticism for those methods back then. They just didn't believe that the result could be so good because they never heard of that method. So it's interesting to kind of reflect on the history of this. A certain degree of skepticism is a good thing in science, because you have to be skeptical about surprising results and kind of confirm them. It didn't take that long for this to be confirmed. So that's the architecture of the network. It's, again, a convolutional net that is applied at multiple scales. So the same image is subsampled. The input window of this neural net is 46 by 46. So every input here is influenced by a 46 by 46 window. It's applied with a sliding window. And then you apply the same convolutional net at multiple scales. But then the features of all of those scales are combined before going to the final classification. So there's a lot of ideas along those lines that a lot of different ways of doing this now that people use. I'll show some examples later. But if you want more details about this, essentially you should take the computer vision, Rob Fergus's computer vision class. That's really, he goes into the gory details of how you do this. So that's an example of this system running. We're able to actually build so this could not run in real time on the CPUs at the time. GPUs were not popular yet. So we implemented like a special piece of hardware on what's called an FPGA, which is sort of configurable hardware, so that we can run this. And Alfredo is familiar with this because he worked with this as well. And this was kind of the results. This is Washington Square Park, if you don't recognize it. The system is far from perfect. It recognizes those bright spots here as desert or sand. And, this is the middle of Manhattan. There is no sand, no desert, certainly. But that was as good as it was at the time. And we could run it at about 20 frames per second on, a special piece of hardware that was about this big. Okay, so this was sort of the groundwork that kind of convinced people, some people at the time, that you could actually implement those things in hardware, and you could, pretty much have this in your car, and it could help you drive a car. There's a long history of hardware neural nets, which I'm not going to go into. I might go into it later lecture, but people started working on neural net hardware back in the 1980s. Okay, so what happened around 2012, 2013 is the fact that our friends at University of Toronto in Jeff Hinton's group, Ilya Sutskever and Alex Krzyzewski, had a very good implementations of convolutional nets on GPU, and that allowed them to train a very large convolutional net on a single GPU at the time, or two GPUs actually, on the ImageNet dataset. And the ImageNet dataset was the first dataset in computer vision that had a large number of training samples and a large number of categories. So it had 1 million training samples, roughly 1.3 million, and 1,000 categories. And it turns out that's really what convolutional nets love. If you have many categories, many training samples, they really shine, and they basically beat everything else. So what you see here is the error rate for what's called the top 5 error rate on this ImageNet dataset. And 2010, 2011, people used more classical approaches where a lot of the things were handcrafted. The architecture looked a bit like a convolutional net, but it was basically handcrafted, was not trained with backprop. And the best people could get was 25.8% error. AlexNet in 2012 got this down to 16%. And that was a watershed moment. Everybody in computer vision essentially stopped what they were doing and switched to using convolutional nets. So the people who didn't basically regretted not doing it. So they did it the year after. And every alternative approach to object recognition was basically abandoned within 2 years. And the error rate, kept going down. Now it's below human error, essentially, for top 5. But people still use ImageNet as a benchmark. And what happened during that period is that the number of layers of those networks basically grew dramatically, particularly with the invention of the ResNet architecture. So this was a paper by Kai-Ming He in 2015. The paper was actually published in 2016, but it was on archive in 2015. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about this. So the basic idea of ResNet is to, by default, make a group of 2 or 3 layers compute the identity function. So it basically copies its input on its output. Okay, you don't change the size, you don't do anything. You just copy the input on the output, and then you have a few layers of a neural net that compute the deviation from the or the so-called residual from the identity. So there's various ways of building those things, and you stack them up. So this is a particular network called ResNet 34. But I would say the workhorse of image recognition, the thing that everybody uses or compare themselves to, is ResNet 50. This particular architecture is a object, a class in PyTorch. You can just build ResNet 50 without thinking about it. There's a lot of variations of this, and you can go to this URL and check the current state of the art on ImageNet. There is like various types of papers with code. Is a small company that was recently acquired by Facebook that basically sort of organizes all the results and papers that people have. This is a chart a few years old. It's about 4.5 years old that Alfredo put together. Alfredo, you should probably make a more recent version of this. That indicates
it's online.
The number of billion of operations on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the top one accuracy on ImageNet. And there's various versions here of ResNet and Inception, which is sort of a Google proposed architecture. And there's a lot more now, and people are up to 90% now, but they use something else than supervised learning. Okay, I'm going to drop out, so I'm going to stop here and let.
Actually, before you disappear, I wanted to do to wish happy birthday to our TAs. They were born the same day, so they remind us one time less.
Amazing.
All right. So good luck with your presentation on the other side, and I keep here the audience enjoyed.
All right. Okay, great. Take care, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.